The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UW-M Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Egypt's dramatic shifts in governance continued this summer as the first president of the post-Mubarak era, Mohammed Morsy, was ousted by the military after just one tempestuous year in office. His brief tenure capped the Muslim Brotherhood's ascent from Egypt's political wilderness to the apex of political power. Now he's been detained indefinitely, scheduled to stand trial in the death of Egyptian protesters. For secular progressive Egyptians, joy at Morsi's departure is tempered by the fact that just as in the 6 decades between Gamal Nasser's 1952 revolution and the fall of the Mubarak regime in 2011, the generals are still in charge. To help us understand what's driving Egypt's ongoing political revolution and where it might be headed, we're joined by Carolyn Seymour-Jorn, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at UW-M, where she also serves as coordinator of the Middle Eastern and North African Studies program. Carolyn, welcome back to International Focus.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I think it'd be useful to start with just a review of the timeline that led us to where we are today. And so why don't we just jump right into that. First slide we've got here is January 25th through February 11th. The massive protests really broke out on the heels of what happened in Tunisia, and talk a little bit about sort of what was driving that and what the atmosphere was in those days.
Sure. Well, the January 25 revolution, as it was called and is still called sometimes, of 2011 was, I think, sort of a surprise to some people in the West who kind of perceived Egypt as this very sort of stable state, or at least a state in which things were under control. But there had been really massive disagreement and anger toward the Mubarak regime for years, if not decades. Not only from the right, the Muslim fundamentalists and other religious fundamentalists, Muslim fundamentalists in the country, but also from the Coptic Christians and from liberal, progressive elements within the country, and from the youth as well. So I think for people who, people living in Egypt or people well acquainted with the Egyptian scene, really saw this revolution as something that was certainly a long time in coming.
Well, and often it's characterized, I think, here as much more of a movement towards democracy and has, I think, perhaps a bigger political component to it than, in fact, occurred for most people on the ground. There was a big economic component to what brought people out, wasn't there?
Absolutely. The Egyptian economy has been deteriorating since the 1970s, really since Sadat instituted the open door policy. And it has, the economy has really tanked in recent years, in particularly, to the extent that and before the revolution, the 2011 revolution, people were having trouble putting bread on the table. Salaries were very low. Young people were having a great deal of difficulty finding jobs. People were going for years unemployed after graduating from college or even technical schools. And there was a tremendous amount of frustration about that. One of the things that we heard very frequently from young people in Egypt prior to the revolution was that they felt unable to even get married as young people because young men in particular couldn't get jobs to support a family, to buy an apartment, to start a new family in. And many young men were going abroad to working in the Gulf states for years upon years, leaving a fiancé at home. So as you can imagine, young people in particular were very frustrated.
Well, let's move forward then. And February 11th of 2011, the announcement comes forward that Mubarak was stepping down. Now, what do you think catalyzed that event?
Well, certainly I think that the sheer number of the crowds that were gathering not only in Tahrir Square, actually, but in other major squares around the city, and not only in Cairo, but in some of the other provincial cities as well. I think it overwhelmed the Mubarak regime. The army was also impressed by the level of anger toward the regime and realized that something had started that couldn't really be stopped. There was really no way of putting a cork in the bottle at this point. And this is not really something that happened quickly or suddenly. It was something that developed over some years after groups like the Kafaya movement, for example, which was an opposition movement to Mubarak, had really sort of helped the populace to become less fearful about speaking out against the regime, had really used technology to its advantage to spread its message, had also really publicized the abuses of the Mubarak regime through internet technology.
Well, I think one of the interesting aspects of the revolution was there weren't really any identifiable single leaders around which it would coalesce. And where, I think I've spoken, and in fact on the show we've had people that were involved, and they said, no, it was the idea that drove it, not a personage. But on the other hand, in the immediate aftermath of Mubarak's departure, there was a bit of a vacuum, right? Mm-hmm. So for about a year and a half, we had a situation where essentially it was the military stepping in and saying, well, we'll grudgingly, as we must, take over yet again. And so that was the situation until in June of 2012, here's our next slide, after a year and a half of military rule, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, Mohammed Morsy, was elected. And he was elected by, not by any means a huge plurality. No. And so tell us what put him over the top. I mean, if numerically his followers would seem not to be able to be successful in an election, so how is it that he won? How is it that he won?
Well, I should say that I had the opportunity to spend a couple weeks in Cairo in January of 2012. And certainly even, at that point, that was almost at the year anniversary of the revolution, you still had protests in the streets, you had opposing parties, you had the liberal progressives, the young people protesting, you had the fundamentalists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and their main complaint at that point was that the SCAF, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces that was running the country, was basically continuing on the Mubarak regime. It was continuing on in the Mubarak regime's methods of repression and was not moving towards democracy. So there was this tremendous sense that the SCAF needed to step down and there needed to be a turnover to civilian power. And even very liberal people were saying, even if the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power, we're not going to like it, we're not going to agree with what they say, but it will be a civilian elected government and we can throw them out after 4 years if we don't like them. But if the military stays in control, we're not going anywhere.
Well, and in fact, the other candidate that made it through the primary, if you will, was very much associated with the old regime, wasn't he?
Right, exactly. And people felt that, I don't know that, well, for one thing, I guess I should say that many young people, liberal progressives, did not vote because they boycotted that vote because they weren't going to vote for a Brotherhood candidate, but they also were not going to vote for the old regime or somebody who basically stood for the old regime. So they boycotted the vote. They felt that they needed to say that it was that there was something really missing here. What was missing? For many people, a new constitution should have been drafted before parliamentary and presidential elections were held, and more time should have been given for other parties to develop coalitions and to put up other candidates for the presidency. So that was part of the problem, that people who might have voted for a more liberal candidate didn't vote at all.
Right. So Morsi is elected. He has a year in office, and looking at the next slide, in the anniversary of his taking office in June of 2013, huge protests. People are again out in the street, and so who are they? Who are the folks? These people who didn't vote and didn't want him in anywhere, or these people who voted and thought, oh my goodness, we don't like what's going on?
Yeah, Morsi turned out to be a tremendously unsuccessful, unpopular president. And I think part of it, I think the crowds, again, were fairly diverse. You had people from really all over the spectrum protesting because they felt that the president was not improving the economy. He was not making any steps that were actually going to alleviate suffering for the Egyptian people. People are very frustrated, as can be. It's easy to understand if you're having trouble feeding your family, wages are low, unemployment is high. People are going to be out in the streets, and I think that really explains that. But millions and millions of people indeed did protest against Morsi and wanted him out of office.
And so next slide, July 3rd of 2013, military announced that he had been removed. Now, what's behind the military, which really more or less supported him at one point,
yes.
right? What accounts for that shift?
I think the military saw that the country was at an impasse, that, again, the situation was so bad that the crowds were not going to go back home until there was a change, that Morsi had become so unpopular and was viewed as so ineffective, essentially, that there was really no way to stop the protests until he was removed from office, essentially. It's important to recognize that the military does sort of stand apart as a separate entity in Egypt and views itself as a sort of, as a protector of the people. And is above the standing government. So, I think it's not necessarily, it's not a surprise to us, or shouldn't be a surprise to us, that the general felt the need or even the right to step in.
But so Morsi is removed, but his followers don't go quietly into the night, and there are now pro-Morsi protests until finally, in the last slide here, on August 14th, the army cracks down in a big way, and there are varying estimates of the number of people killed and injured, from several hundred to a few thousand.
Yeah.
So what prompted that?
Well, this is a very sad part of the story, and actually on August 11th, there had been mass protests in the Rabia al-Adawiya Mosque in Cairo, and the government had cracked down on those protesters as well. And then on the 14th, you have this really violent removal of protesters, killing many people, depending on estimates, as you say, hundreds of people killed. I think in this case, the army is attempting at all costs to sort of create stability, to try to keep the Egyptian people from panicking, to lessen any fears that, things might devolve into sort of, more involved civil strife or civil war. But it's a very sad development, and liberals and progressives that were calling for Morsi to step down were very angered and very dismayed by this show of violence, because even though they did not want the Brotherhood in power, they certainly didn't want to see this level of violence and destruction.
Well, I think that brings us more or less up to date, but before we go on, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're taking a look at Egypt with Carolyn Seymour-Jorn. So before the break, we sort of sketched out the chronology here. So where are we now?
Well, we are again in a situation in which the military is basically in control of Egypt, to the dismay, I think, of many citizens, even though they were very much opposed to the government of Morsi. At the same time, many people feel that this is really sort of a putting a halt to the democratic process that began when Morsi was elected. People who were happy to see Morsi go are hoping that the interim government that was appointed can play a stronger role and ultimately sort of restart the process toward democracy.
And is there a timeline? Is there any sort of definable process towards that goal?
Well, there is a continued work on the Constitution. After the 2011 revolution, constitutional amendments were made, first of all, to put the country on a process to get parliamentary and presidential elections going. In December of 2012, a new constitution was approved. But that new constitution, in fact, was actually part of the reason for Morsi's downfall, in that it really didn't give people the rights that they were hoping for, the improved rights that they were hoping for. In fact, that 2012 Constitution really affirmed the power of the generals in the country. It also strengthened the role of Islamic law, the role of the scholars at Al-Azhar to impact legislation in the country. It did not define women's rights clearly. So what's happening now is that there is a renewed effort to try to amend these aspects of the Constitution such that the country can move forward in a more democratic process. And many people are hoping that a revised Constitution, an amended Constitution, will improve the voice for minorities in the country, including the very significant Coptic Christian minority, which was basically not really addressed in that first Constitution.
But as of now, there's no timeline for new elections, for example. So there's an interim president whose tenure could be months,
right.
years, potentially?
Right. As far as I know, I don't know of a timeline for new elections.
So let's talk a little bit about the opposition. As you say, it's very diverse. Mm-hmm. We assume that the people who wanted sort of more of a pluralistic and participatory democracy haven't changed, but has the fall of Morsi changed some of the other elements of the opposition?
I don't think so necessarily, although I think many people are deeply saddened by this recent wave of violence against the Morsi supporters. I think we really need to keep in mind that you have this tremendous youth population, not only in Egypt, but across the Arab world. And it's really this youth bulge, this young population that fueled the 2011 revolution to begin with, right? I mean, they were really the people who were out there in the square to begin with. They coordinated, they really began the revolution and kept it going. Those young people are still there. And they're still striving towards this, building a society in which they can continue to live their own lives, raise children in a more democratic and a safer country for themselves. I don't think that many of those young people are really surprised in some ways by the slow process of revolution. I think many people recognize that, taking apart a 30-year-old authoritarian regime with even longer roots in, authoritarian rulership is not going to be easy. That it's not just going to be a single revolution, it's not going to be a single bout of violence, that this will go on for some time, and that although people are frustrated, they see this as a process. I don't mean to downplay how frustrated the people are. But I don't think that the Brotherhood is going to go away. I don't think that the youth opposition to either Morsi or to the generals is going to go away either.
And what about the even more fundamentalist sort of political Islam elements of society? I mean, Morsi on that adjusted scale was actually,
That's right.
not the most extreme by any means.
Yeah. And in fact, the Salafists, who are the ultra-right-wing Islamists in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East, won a considerable amount, almost a quarter of the votes to the parliament in the November 2012 elections. So certainly they have a presence in the country. They're very well organized. They have a certain following. I don't think they're going to go away either. The Salafist-oriented individuals see their approach towards sort of going back to an ideal version of the Islamic society as the best solution to sort of improve and rejuvenate Egyptian society. And their ideas, although they're sort of extreme, appeal to many people who see their approach as simple as maybe the most direct way to revive and revitalize society.
So is there some way of accommodating those many different poles of political thought?
That's the question, because in fact, I mean, when we look at the Kifaya movement, which began in 2008 and very successfully held nonviolent protests and helped to usher in the 2011 revolution, the Kifaya movement did manage to articulate both young progressives, liberals, and more conservative Islamist-oriented individuals. The problem is, how do you translate that sort of interaction between very polarized groups from a sort of activist movement into a governmental structure? It's very difficult to do because the ideas are so diverse. One of the things that has always been a difficulty between liberal progressives and the Salafists in particular is the status of women. So the Salafists, for example, want to make sure that the role of women is conscribed within the boundaries of religious law, which could be interpreted in many different ways. But a Salafist interpretation is one in which women's role is primarily in the home, and which is not going to necessarily protect women's rights in the workplace or in the public sphere more generally.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the problem this poses for U.S. foreign policy and Egyptian relations. I mean, in fact, the military did take what was a legitimately elected president and remove him. Secretary Kerry recently said that, no, this wasn't a coup. In fact, it was a restoration of democracy. I mean, how do we square that circle?
It's very difficult to do because even within Egypt, you have many people saying, in fact, Morsi, while you could argue that he was fairly elected, in fact, there was such a low turnout at the elections that we may not necessarily consider it a fair election. Many people, as I said earlier in the show, felt that Egypt and Egyptians were not really given enough time to put together legitimate parties that could face off Morsi, and so that it wasn't really truly a fair election. Morsi was starting to do things that were very alarming to the populace. He was trying to lessen the powers of the judiciary. And the Constitution that he pushed through also really left out the voices of the Christian minority and did not protect women to the extent that many people hoped a new constitution would. So there are people in Egypt as well who are arguing this was a regime that was moving toward fascism, and therefore it was legitimate to take it down. So this is an argument in the United States as well, and it's very difficult to decide who's right, particularly now looking at the terrible violence that has ensued after Morsi has been removed from office.
So we've got about 30 seconds. What best case scenario for, say, the next year in Egypt?
I think the best case scenario is that there is a sort of renewed movement among the young people to make their voices heard. I hope that the young people in Egypt and that everybody in Egypt who is really hoping for a more democratic process is not frustrated and kind of deterred from continuing this process, because there really has been such a strong series of movements for democratization. And I think that given a little bit more time to organize, those groups will be successful.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that. Carolyn Seymour-Jorn, thank you very much.
Thanks.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,